Welcome to Hushicho Talks. I'm Hushicho, and today I'm talking about Supernatural the animation. Those of you who listened to my drunken review about Supernatural the live-action series probably know my feelings about Supernatural. I was honestly part of the kind of fringe fandom. I enjoyed the fandom for what it was, and I would do like different things for a kink men. But I never really got very much into the series because I just couldn't wrap my mind around so many of the inconsistencies it had, and I really just didn't care much for the cast or crew. But Supernatural the animation was a new opportunity, an opportunity to be completely animated, completely separate from the live-action series, and to do something completely different as well, to do things that they couldn't achieve easily with live-action and to be more adventurous. So did it succeed? Well, it's kind of a mixed bag. The first time I had seen it, or tried to watch it, I was really not that impressed. The second time I didn't quite make it through. This time I made it through. I have to say that there are more good episodes than bad ones, but when it's bad, it's absolutely horrid. Basically though, this is the chance you take with any series, and even animated series tend to be this way. They usually get really bad near the end in my experience and have a really crappy ending, so honestly, it would be unfair to say that it's as bad as I had originally thought, because just a couple of episodes that are really bad don't make a series really bad. That being said, however, the series doesn't quite do enough to make it a really super-duper good classic series. It's good enough. It's pretty good. It's good for a watch, minus a couple of episodes, which I will tell you about. I liked the Japanese voices. I really couldn't get behind most of the English ones, but then I have a lot more experience of Japanese voices around me, having been surrounded by Japanese voices for a period of my life. So it's all in personal preference, but I will say that at least the Japanese voices are consistent throughout, and the English voices changed very close to the end, but that's also something I'll be talking about here. The voice acting is generally very good. Even the English one, which I really couldn't get into for a number of reasons, the voice acting was overall very good. There were some that were better than others, but then the same goes for the Japanese. Overall, it was a really good effort. The music was good. The visuals I wanted to talk about, they were quite distinctive. They had very solid blacks, and it was almost like a Western comic look that they were trying to go for, because it was very bold, and it had that chiaroscuro sort of look. The differences between solid, absolute black that does not exist in nature, and the white space, which of course was filled in by color, but it's still a very uncommon style to see in animation, especially Japanese animation. Fans of the live-action series are very split on it, and some are desperate to declare it non-canon, because there's of course all this wank over canon, and we can throw that out because I don't give two shits. But anyway, the Supernatural animated series is one of those things that I feel like definitely had a good basis, and generally realised it fairly well, because it stuck with the first couple of seasons of Supernatural, and I think that was a good thing. Supernatural was one of those series where it started off and sort of threw itself in a ditch, and then it kind of kept flopping back in the ditch for a while, kind of making me question creator Eric Kripke's amazing vision for the show. It's kind of like George Lucas's amazing vision for all the episodes of Star Wars that we know he didn't really have. But once it got into the pattern of, oh, I sacrificed my life for you, oh, I sacrificed my life for you, oh, I sacrificed my life for you, it just kind of got old, and you got kind of tired of that same recurring basic fundamental of the plot line in it. So this at least sticks to the first two seasons in a basic manner. One of the things that it does better than the live-action series is it more consistently shows that the brothers are not the kind who just kill something because it happens to be non-human. Their father might be, but not really. They basically try and make it seem like he's that kind of asshole, but he is also proven throughout the series to be less of an asshole than he seems, although he still is pretty much a really horrible father and a generally awful person. But throughout the animated series, at least, we see that the brothers are more willing to understand the supernatural entities rather than in the live-action series, where there's a lot of knee-jerk killing things, regardless of whether or not they had a good reason for doing what they're doing, or, you know, whether or not they're actually doing something good, even if people misunderstand them. I really liked that about the animated series. It does a better job of making it clearer that just because something isn't human does not necessarily make it evil, and it doesn't also set the Winchesters against them. All it means is that things are easily misunderstood, and it might get heated before the misunderstanding is worked out. Another thing I would like to cover is the fact that the Supernatural animated series is about 20 minutes per episode, whereas the live-action series is a network broadcast hour. A network broadcast hour is somewhere around 40-45 minutes long, so you have to allow for the advertisements and whatnot. I have to say, the 20-minute long format is vastly superior. There is so much better about that. It is so much better to just have a 20-minute story, because most of these episodes only have enough content to fill 20 minutes. You watch just about any of the live-action show, and you will notice very quickly that there was a lot of filler. There's a lot of stuff that doesn't really add anything to the story, but it provides time. It fills time. It wastes time. So I really especially liked the fact that the animated series kind of had to get down to business as quickly as possible, and that made it a lot more exciting, a lot more interesting too, because we don't have a lot of these tertiary and often superfluous parts drawn into it that don't really add much of anything to it and don't really help the story either. Now I'm going to go through the specific episodes and let you know my thoughts of them. The series overall, I would say it's worth a watch, minus a couple of episodes I'll tell you about. Also, I will say you don't have to watch the final 2 episodes, there's no reason to watch the final 2 episodes, and they add absolutely nothing to the series. In fact, they detract from it. It's kind of like they got past the first major plot point in the first 2 seasons and then thought, yeah, we're just going to tack this on, and then it'll just be kind of a cliffhanger ending, kind of, sort of, and yeah. I don't know why they had those last 2 episodes, especially with that story. I know that it was something that they felt like they needed to do to get rid of the yellow-eyed demon. But at the same time, I kind of feel like while it did tie up part of the story, it would have been better to just do without it, because they weren't going to make a second series of the Supernatural animation. So take that as you will. I didn't think the last 2 episodes were even worth watching, but you may. Personally, I felt that episode 20 rather than episode 22 is really the best way to end it, because it was a very solid episode, the ending was superb, and it really kind of made it seem like the way that it ended, and even like with a snatch from the ending sequence, a very picturesque vision, that was probably how they intended for the series to end. So that's where I would really leave off. Now, getting to the episodes themselves, I have to say I would not start off with episode 1. In fact, to be honest, I don't really see any reason to start before episode 5. But I will take the first 4 episodes and let you know about them. The first 4 episodes were really kind of uneven, in my opinion. They were not all bad, but the ones that were bad were the worst of the series. And the ones that were good were, just kind of serviceable. The first one is called The Alter Ego, and it's about a shapeshifter. This is a really good first episode because it not only introduces the characters in an exciting way, it also allows them to reveal backstory without seeming obvious or ridiculous or forced. Because, of course, the shapeshifter absorbs memories. Basically, as one of the characters said, it downloads memories. So it's a really pretty strong first episode, even if it's kind of... There are moments where it's just kind of like, well, I kind of don't buy that. But, you know, you just have to kind of swallow it with a grain of salt and go on from the episode. It was a good establishing episode that got you into the series but didn't really get too terribly deep in any particular direction. The second episode is unfortunately all over the fucking place. It's one of those where you know what's going on from the very beginning, but you hope that's not what's going on because it's so obvious and it's so disappointing. So you get there by the end and you're like, well, that just sucked. I really did not like the second episode. I didn't think it was a very good choice for the second episode because the first episode wasn't like knock your socks off great, but it was serviceable, as I said. It was a good introduction and it didn't hold your hand too much and it wasn't too stupid in introducing the characters or the situations. The premise was very well introduced, or at least well enough introduced by the first episode. The second episode was not a good follow-up. The third one tries to build more on their backstory, but it's also kind of an unfortunately predictable one. It does introduce a psychic named Missouri, and she's a really, really cool character, but she's underused, and ultimately the story is one that every time I've tried to watch it, I've always ended up getting so bored throughout the middle, and because you know what's going to happen. I mean, there's no real mystery of what is going to happen in it. So episode 3 is another one that just doesn't really pick up. It illustrates more of the backstory, which is good because by this point we haven't really had all that much. But at the same time, it might have been a better choice just to introduce the backstory in oblique references or flashbacks, brief flashbacks, instead of taking us directly to where it happened and involving someone else in it. The fourth episode, skip it. Just skip it. It's an awful episode. It has really offensive handling of well, it's... See, there's a problematic attitude that's finally getting advanced beyond in Japan, and that's the unfortunate collusion and confusion of gay and transsexual. And it's okay to have a character who is male but really kind of feminine and, you know, classically feminine in gestures and manner and such. But the way it's handled here is too close to the way it's handled in a number of other anime series and comics and such. And the character isn't treated well either. This is not uncommon for Supernatural, the series, especially the live-action series, which has typically treated its non-heterosexual characters horribly, but with a few exceptions. But Ghosts on the Highway, skip it. It's not worth seeing, it's not worth thinking about. It was actually the episode that completely turned me off the animation the first time I tried to watch it, and it took me several months to really come back round to giving it another chance. It just was not that good. It was that bad that I consider it the absolute nadir of the series. I think it is the worst episode, and in no circumstances should you put yourself through it. The rest of the series is good enough that if you just skip episode 4, you'll get a decent series. You'll probably be like, well, that was pretty good by the time of the end. Don't watch episode 4. It's offensively bad, and unfortunately, most shows do have at least one episode where you just have to say, I guess they had a bad day, somebody didn't do their job, things came together in the worst possible way, and that episode was the result. Episode 5 is a really interesting one, and although it doesn't resolve as well as I thought it would, because the hunter dude named Jason in it is a real asshole, and basically no one would lose anything of value if they had just killed him off, just snap. It gets a little sanctimonious, but the good part is that it introduces a vampire character who inherits his vampire powers, so I guess, well, I'm not sure if he would be a Dhampir, but either way, he inherits his vampire powers, and the brothers are forced to confront the fact that just because someone's a hunter doesn't make them good, and just because someone's a vampire, a classic monster, it also doesn't make them bad. Dean is kind of a dick in this, though, but we sort of start to see that a lot of his attitude is a put-on. He's really kind of a softie, and that's the first episode where it gets really conveyed to us in a clear manner. The next one, episode 6, is a flashback episode. We understand from the beginning that Sam's girlfriend Jessica is deceased. We've heard oblique references to it up to this point, but this is an actual flashback that kind of combines the expectations from another of the episodes from the live-action series that dealt with the urban legend of Bloody Mary. This is a pretty good episode, actually, although it kind of is one of those things that I've always had a problem with flashbacks that involve characters we know are dead, and we know that not only was this not the time that they died, but it doesn't matter because we can't really be too worried about them. We can't be really too worried about them because we know they're going to die eventually and have died before the series began, or we know that they're in no danger now because they had to survive to die later. So it's a good episode overall, but there's that one nagging sort of thing that makes me think they could have done a better job simply by having Sam and Dean deal with the ghost in the present, and having some flashbacks that involved some of Jessica's friends, perhaps. Episode 7 was a pretty simple, straightforward episode called Temptation of the Demon, and it involves the yellow-eyed demon tempting a woman who is very faithful because her daughter is like death's door. So the boys get more of an exposure to the kind of difficult decisions that people have to make when they're dealing with this yellow-eyed demon. And as the audience, we understand that there is really not a right or wrong here, because the woman ends up doing things that we might say, well, that's wrong, but she's doing it for the right reason. So it's a complex moral, ethical issue, and so it's very difficult to say, well, that's wrong and I wouldn't do that. I mean, you can say you wouldn't do it, but it's not really something you can say, well, nobody would do that, nobody should do that. So it raises a lot of difficult questions, which is good, because that's exactly what it should do. Bobby also gets in on this, and he's of course a very different Bobby, just like Missouri, from the live-action series. So it's a different take on him, and it's very interesting. Episode 8 is Everlasting Love, and it's an interesting murder mystery. It reminded me a lot of Cool Air, actually, the Lovecraft story, which is one of my favourites. I always thought Cool Air was kind of romantic, but Everlasting Love is kind of that way too, and it's interesting because even though the guy that's going around killing people feels that the boys are too young to understand his loss and his sense of solitude, they really can understand a lot better than he gives them credit for. So that's also a character building exercise on the part of the boys, which is a good idea for the writing. By now we've kind of seen that both Sam and Dean are much more three-dimensional. At this point they've been developed to the point where we're aware that Dean puts on a lot and he bluffs a lot, but he's actually kind of a softie and a nice guy. Sam is also, he tries to be sensitive, and they're both damaged goods, really. but he is deeply damaged by the loss of Jessica, and still kind of feels bad over his mother. And in the first couple of seasons, of course, Sam was still having his psychic visions and struggling with his psychic powers, which are developed along the animated series, which I felt was a really interesting aspect that they should have really kept. Episode 9 is one of my favourites, if not my absolute favourite for the entire series. It's called The Spirit of Vegas. It is one of those oddball episodes, but it's a humorous episode with some significantly serious elements to it. In it, Dean is basically taken over by a bimbogami, which is a poverty god. And it's hilarious. It is absolutely hilarious. And it's really good. Like, it works out in a really great way. When I was watching it, I couldn't help but think, this is the kind of plot that I would see on one of the lighter episodes of Cowboy Bebop or something like that. I was really impressed by it. And also, I think it's because of the 20-minute runtime, it was a much better attempt than they ever did on the live-action show. The live-action show, whenever they had a funny episode, it could never manage to be funny for even most, or even half, of its running time. Almost every funny episode of Supernatural, the live-action series, had about maybe half of it being funny, and the other half being incredibly angsty, like even ramped up angst levels more than usual, as if to make up for the fact that the first bit was actually amusing. It's a shame because there are some really great, amusing ideas in the live-action series that they could have made funny episodes. And it makes me think of another kind of similar series, Charmed, which, like Supernatural, had funny episode titles that were often pop culture references. But with Charmed, a lot of the time you can sort of see, well, it's not good, but you can tell that they kind of had tongue-in-cheek here, or they weren't being serious here, or at least they had a sort of a sense of humour about it. With Supernatural, it seems like more often than not they take themselves and the show way too seriously. Whereas with the animation, I don't know, it's not that they don't take the material seriously, it's just that in an episode like The Spirit of Vegas, for example, they know how to have fun, they know how to relax for one episode at least. And that's good, that's really nice. It's nice to have an episode like this, especially since the series basically goes into high gear after this, and it's just one episode after another of rather dramatic and kind of angsty stuff. The Spirit of Vegas, if you watch no other episode of the animated series, that's the one to watch. It's really amusing and it shows the characters very well. Episode 10 is called Moonlight, and it's about werewolves. This is one that I thought was okay, but it relied too much on stupid parts of the plot that didn't make any sense or made you go, you know what, I don't buy that, that's bullshit. And you knew it was going to end up in some tragic twist, but it didn't make sense the way it got there. Werewolves transform regardless of whether the drapes are pulled. Whether it's cloudy, whether it's clear, it is a lunar cycle. It does not matter if they see the moon, it's still full. Them not seeing the moon does not make it less full. If a werewolf is compelled to transform when it's a full moon, it does not matter whether or not they see the moon. So that whole concept was really stupid. I felt like it was a really solid story up to then, especially with the Winchesters deciding that, you know what, as a couple of times in the past, we weren't going to assume that just because someone had a curse, just because someone was not human, that made them evil or responsible for their actions when they were taken over by the beast. This was a good aspect of it, it just wasn't executed very well, and ended up, in the end, being an extremely disappointing episode. It wasn't totally bad, especially for the character development, but it left me feeling that they could have and should have done better and more with it and ended it differently rather than just have someone die yet again so that Sam can have another tragic interest in his life, or, you know, a parallel to Jessica. It seems to be a kind of a waste of a character and almost kind of insulting to the character. The next episode, episode 11, is called Nightmare. This is a really interesting episode in which Sam explores his powers and they find someone else who has kind of similar powers to him but developed in a different way. It's very interesting because it also presents no easy questions and no easy answers. So it's one of those that's difficult to categorize because it's interesting, it has interesting characters in it, but it's also really unpleasant. And it's an episode like this where you are reminded that Supernatural is a horror series because the revulsion level is really high. By the end of the episode, you just kind of feel like, well, that didn't end well, but it kind of is expected. And that's a shame, because it would have been a much more interesting episode if it had been handled a different way. It could have been better, I think, if the characters in the difficult situation didn't just seem to exist to kind of develop Sam. It's like Madison in the previous episode, the werewolf. If she didn't have the feeling of a character who exists purely for Sam's development, it would have been different. And I have to say, I really loved it when Dean was trying to lighten the situation by doing his cat and dog sound singing. That was really charming and wonderful. Like, I really liked that about the Moonlight episode. I thought that was really cute. Nightmare is one of those that, well, it is kind of a nightmare. The reality of these people is kind of a nightmare. And that's a shame. It's an episode that will not make you feel good, honestly. I can't really say that it is the worst episode, because I don't think overall it's bad, but it does have a lot of really unpleasant things in it, like child abuse, animal abuse, a lot of pretty grisly violence, and it deals with some difficult issues. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend it to those who are easily triggered or easily traumatized about these things, because they're not easy issues to deal with. The next episode, episode 12, is one that it was okay. It introduced yet another of the special characters with the powers like Sam. Unfortunately, this one, Lily, had a terrible power that was essentially a curse to her. Anybody that she touched would die. And that was an extremely, extremely bad power to have, obviously. John gets on the case, and it unfolds gradually. We find John isn't quite so much of an asshole as we would expect him to be, but he's still kind of an asshole. Lily's story is sad, but ultimately John is not really interesting enough for me for him to carry an episode by himself. So this is not one that I felt was just super duper, because John is not a character that you really end up liking unless you've made up your mind that you're going to like him. Episode 13 is an interesting one called What Lives in the Lake, and this is another one where people assume that just because something is monstrous, non-human or supernatural, that it must be doing something bad or wrong. However, the whole thing takes kind of almost a, I don't know, it's sort of almost a Rashomon kind of feel to it, because everybody has their own story about it, and everybody of course has their own perspective, and it's only near the end where everything starts to kind of come together. It's an interesting episode, and it's a good idea. I felt like it was fairly well handled, and ended up being something that, when you looked at it, was generally a positive episode, and it made me feel good, it made me smile. Episode 14 is called Reunion, where the boys are reunited with their father. Unfortunately, it's trying to cram too much into one single episode. They reunite with John, and then they bring back Ryan, who was the vampire from the earlier episode, and his father. Except in the earlier episode, his father, who was very protective of Ryan and who didn't want his vampiric powers to awaken, had tried everything, and he had killed a lot of hunters, but to be fair, they were basically just gunning for him and his family anyway, and besides which a hunter had killed his wife. They had never done anything against humans to that point, so essentially the hunters brought it on themselves. That being said, in this episode, they want us to believe that for some reason Ryan was victimized after the Winchesters left him last time. His father snapped and made a deal with the Yellow-Eyed Demon rather, and made this deal to save Ryan's life. Well, John, of course, being a gigantic douchehole, decides, oh yeah, we're gonna have to take him out. Well, you get part of a plot building up of them, making the attempt to try and save Ryan's father, because obviously they're not gonna hurt Ryan, because Ryan still has his ethics, very strong beliefs. But unfortunately, what you get is a really sloppy non-resolution where they break their promises and nothing seems to come of it. Like, there's no real resolution to Ryan's plot. He gets out of where he was endangered and basically we never see him again. So this was one that I also number among the worst of the series, not because it dealt so poorly with its plot threads, because it did, but because it also undermined the idea of redeemable monsters, quote-unquote monsters. In doing what it did, it made it seem like, well, it was a bit like the earlier one with the very religious mother who had made a deal with the Yellow-Eyed Devil to save her daughter, the episode 7, I believe. But unlike that one, they didn't try really too hard in this one. It just seemed like they were all, well, we're gonna fight some vampires. It seemed like a very half-assed episode. So it seems like all the episodes that are the worst have a 4, which is kind of funny, appropriate for a Japanese horror series, but whatever. Anyway, episode 14 joins episode 4 in episodes that I would really not watch if I were watching Supernatural the animation. Your mileage may vary, but frankly I don't think it's worth watching. It's not a good episode. Basically, even when there's supposed to be some sort of development between the brothers and their father, even resentment, awakening again between Sam and John, we don't really get enough of it, and Sam is kind of a giant pushover anyway. Not really something that I feel develops either character very well. The next episode is called Devil's Trap, and this one is kind of a mess, but it's also not bad at all. It develops the relationship between the brothers and their father a lot more than the previous episode had. Frankly, this is why I say skip episode 14, because you don't really miss anything. When you pop into Devil's Trap, episode 15, you get more than you probably even want of their relationship and how it develops together. It's a neat episode, and finally, at the end, Sam actually shows that he and Dean have changed a lot. They're not the same people that they were when their father was around, and their father's vendettas don't necessarily match their own. Their father's vendetta doesn't dictate their decisions in life, and John has to accept this ultimately, which I think is good development for all the characters involved, because John, as usual, was being secretive, barking orders, and basically expecting everybody to do exactly what he expected them to do. It's a good episode, and much better than the previous episode, illustrates the relationship between the Winchesters and their father. This is good because in the next episode, that is a crucial element of the plot. I still don't think that John is particularly likable, but it does show that he can do the right thing when it's needed. In My Time of Dying, episode 16, picks up where the previous episode left off, and if you weren't aware, as I wasn't aware until this time watching, after the ending credits is actually kind of I guess it's kind of a teaser for the next episode, but it often has plot elements in it. So don't skip those because you might actually miss something leading into the next episode, as I did the first time I was watching through the whole series. Episode 16 is In My Time of Dying, where Dean, who is in terrible, terrible condition, is basically, well, dying. John has survived with minimal wounds, and so has Sam. Sam is generally okay, and his father, while still in hospital and still injured, is much better off than Dean is. Unfortunately, Dean finds himself confronted by a Reaper, essentially, and, well, things don't really improve on their own. John makes the right decision, though, and has to put aside his age-long vendetta to save the life of his son, whom, to be frank, he endangered. It's one of those moments where a character who was really not that likable or sympathetic in any way gets an element of respect, I think. I felt like John was the kind of character who you really don't like. You never like at any point, but you can kind of see why he makes the decisions he makes. Ultimately, however, he fits neatly into the Captain Ahab stereotype. He's so consumed with vengeance and so fixated on the single object of his vengeance that nothing else really matters around him, and so even the people that are supposed to be dear to him end up being sacrificed, injured, or endangered, as it's very vividly painted in this episode. His sons have nearly died. One of them is going to die if he doesn't do something. I felt that this was a really good episode and handled it in an extremely dramatic way, which is really amazing to me, because typically I don't like the episodes that have a high Eric Kripke influence. A lot of his stuff I get a feeling of tremendous pretension and just obnoxiousness. So I thought this episode was surprisingly really good, and especially with the previous episode, Devil's Trap, that kind of set up events for a really meaningful character development. It wasn't just like Madison had gone before, or any of the other characters who would die to give Sam some kind of development, or would pop up in an episode and then never pop up again. This was actually meaningful and had some sort of significance to give all characters involved development and make them better characters. The next episode is kind of disappointing. It's called Rising Sun, episode 17. It's based off of a series of comic books that were released as a series tie-in. Unfortunately, the boys in it are basically too young to be compelling as protagonists, and it seems more like we just got it to keep John around for another episode. That's unfortunate because, as stated before, he doesn't really carry stories very well on his own. It's not that it's a really bad story, it's just that it doesn't really seem to fit, especially as it has an important female character that we have never heard mentioned up to this time. It's just one of those where you kind of watch it and you think, yeah, that was an episode. It wasn't really that good. You don't have to skip it, but you don't really lose anything by not watching it. You could actually watch the beginning and end of it to see bits with Missouri and bits with the brothers as adults, and you don't really miss anything if you don't watch the middle part, the story part. Episode 18 is called Crossroad. It is a really neat episode because it's it's one of those where we get more development of the brothers as characters, and the brothers having their own interpersonal relationship developed, which I really liked. It's interesting because Dean gets the option to do something that would basically have invalidated the significant sacrifice his father made, and he makes the right decision by not taking up that offer. So that was something that I felt was really important and very strong, and it was something that is so often not seen in stories. Unfortunately, they kind of flip this later, which is yet another reason why I think the last two episodes are best avoided, because that whole plot twist in I want to say the second season, was just not welcome. It undermined the strength of the characters, and it undermined a lot of the plotting that had happened up to then. It seemed like something that happened only because they got to that point and they thought, oh shit, we don't know what to do now. But Crossroad is actually a really good episode. It's definitely one that is compelling and exciting, and it'll set you up for the next few episodes. Loser is one of those where it's downbeat and depressing, but that's kind of to be expected. Episode 19 takes the brothers to an inner city area in a place that is just very run down and people don't have a lot of hope. It deals heavily with yet another of the people with the psychic gifts that, like Sam has, but it doesn't really handle itself very well, and it's extremely predictable. It tries to be shocking with a twist, but the twist we really saw coming from a mile away, and it's not shocking at all, it's just depressing. It's not a good episode overall, I don't think, but the character of Jake was an interesting enough one, even if he wasn't handled particularly well. Either way, I think it was a mistake to bring him back after this episode, because the episode was really his story in a nutshell. There shouldn't have been any more. The next episode is episode 20, What Is and What Should Never Be. But I will cover that after the last episodes, because I view What Is and What Should Never Be as the finale. I think that's a good idea. Episodes 21 and 22 are All Hell Breaks Loose Part 1 and 2. This is possibly the worst resolution to the story. I'm not sure which I like less, the animated version of this story or the live-action version of this story, because neither one of them is particularly well done. It's all over the place. It's a huge mess. There's just so many things that happen in it that either take up time or don't need to happen. The last two episodes are right there with episode 4 and 14 as completely non-essential episodes. In fact, I'd imagine that the only reason the most people watched those two episodes were because one of the English actors was the voice for the last two episodes. Not the rest of the series, though. Which gives me yet another impression that, in fact, these last two episodes were kind of not intended to end the series. They probably didn't intend to actually do these last two to tie up the story, because it really doesn't tie up a story. It ties up elements of it, but then it raises even more elements, and it leads into something else, and it's very disappointing in that way and extremely frustrating. Going back to episode 20, though, What Is and What Should Never Be, it's another one of those adapted episodes from the live-action series, and it's adapted very well. There are some kind of too convenient moments, but all in all, it's an extremely meaningful episode that doesn't have a lot of let's kill this, let's beat this up, let's do this. Instead, it's more of a character story, and it focuses on the character of Dean, who is basically the character that we have been growing closer and closer to during the series. Sam, while he has moments of being in the spotlight, is obviously not the character that they really chose to be the main character during Supernatural the animation. And I approve of this. I think it's a good idea, because Dean is one of the characters that really needs to change the most of all, and we have to understand his character before we can understand how significant the changes he goes through over the series really are. He always compares himself to his father, and he's always been under the thumbnail of his father all his life. He was always the good son, the faithful son, and yet his father was kind of, well, Sam was always forgiven, always affectionately regarded. You know, even though they had their fallings out and arguments and whatnot, even though Sam ended up leaving them, walking away, there's still this sort of feeling that Sam got treated more gently than Dean did. Dean was treated very harshly. Dean was forced to do things that he never wanted to do. Dean was basically forced into a lifestyle that he never asked for. And that really hits you as the series goes on. He's not really an asshole, he just learned from an asshole how to live life. So he's making way the best he can, and he's coping with it the best he can. Dean, inside, is actually a profoundly sensitive person who is actually a huge softie with a big, generous heart. When you see What Is and What Should Never Be, it basically says, here is Dean's fantasy of an ideal life. Here is what would happen if none of the tragedies had occurred and all of these things had been avoided. He's disoriented, and obviously it's kind of disappointing, especially when he realizes that because their mother never died and they never became supernatural hunters, he and Sam never really grew together. They don't have anything in common, and he realizes that during the dream that he has. They don't have anything in common. They really have no reason to hang out. The fact that they were searching for their father and fighting supernatural menaces brought them closer together and forced them to develop in their relationship between each other. But in an idyllic life where their mother survived and there was none of this hunting nonsense, they didn't really have any reason to do that. It's all about Dean being in a dream, and all about him realizing that, as beautiful as the dream is, he can't handle it. He's not prepared for it because he's the same person that he was going into the dream. So it's a very dreamlike experience. Everybody else is different. Everybody else acts like they've lived this reality all of their lives, whereas Dean remembers the other reality, the one that we know. And that reconciliation is all the more difficult, especially since he has finally enjoyed the simple pleasures of life, the beautiful little things that make life worth living, and it has to be his choice to get them out of it. So it ends up in a really fulfilling way, and the final ending is just really very nice, very respectful, and it's an appropriate ending for the series. Even though it didn't go, yeah, the yellow-eyed demon is sorted, you know, all these people with powers, they're sorted. We didn't really need the all hell breaks loose, because all it does is picks up a bunch of plot threads, ties up most of them in a hasty and sloppy way, and then adds more new plot threads because we can't have a neatly tied up ending. Since they were probably aware that it was just going to be one season and that was it, I really wish they hadn't done that. But, fortunately, you can stop at episode 20 and it's a perfectly okay series. So, all in all, I would say I had a pretty fun time with Supernatural the animation. I liked the different takes on the characters, and for the most part I feel like it worked a lot better than the live-action series, especially with the 20-minute episodes. It was really nice to see a much more condensed, quicker-moving, more exciting, more gripping, less filler-oriented series, because the idea of the series is really good. I also like the fact that in the animation, it gave a little bit more emphasis to the fact that just because something isn't a human doesn't make it an evil monster. Our actions are what determine good or evil. The motives behind our actions are what determine good or evil. Just someone being a hunter or a vampire or werewolf do not necessarily make them good or evil. Some episodes handled this better than others, but overall the series did a pretty good job of trying to be fair and not just trying to knee-jerk leap on whatever they thought well, we need to have someone kill a vampire this week. Well, they're going to kill zombies this week. Well, we're going to have them kill a werewolf this week. Most of the time it was presented in a way, although sometimes needlessly tragic and in a way that didn't add anything to the story, it still made it moving and still tried to make them, at least, even if it didn't succeed, into compelling characters in their own right that we could sympathise with and feel sorry for when they inevitably met with tragedy. It was kind of predictable in a lot of these cases, but at the very least it wasn't just a knee-jerk reaction that by this point the live-action series is kind of settled into. So overall, I have to say, if you just start at episode 5, skip episode 14, and stop at episode 20, you'll have a good time. You will probably really like Supernatural, the animation. Just don't watch the live-action series expecting it to be really the same. And it's up to you whether you watch the first few episodes, but for God's sake, don't watch episode 4. You will hate it. Or if you're drunk, you will probably laugh at how terrible it is. The other 3 episodes, they're not really worth watching. Episode 1, yeah, it's okay. You can watch it to get kind of an idea, but really you'll get as much of an idea from any of the other episodes. Episode 3, if you want some background to the characters, but they'll cover it later, so it's not necessary. Episode 2 adds absolutely nothing to the series, just like episode 4, and while it's much better than episode 4, it's still not good. So, all in all, that's what I say. Start at episode 5, stop at episode 20, skip episode 14. You'll have an okay time with Supernatural, in the way, really the only way, that I feel is enjoyable. It's also much shorter than just watching the first 2 seasons, and you get a lot less of the bullshit, weird plot points that they tried to bring up and then dropped later, or ignored, or never brought to any sort of fruition. So, I'll give it a hesitant recommend, but go in knowing that it's not exactly like the live-action series, which apparently freaks some people out. Actually, I think it's a lot better than the live-action series, but that still doesn't make it really super great. You have to be in the mood, and if you're in the mood and you want to, keep in mind that it's a horror series, so a lot of the episodes are going to be kind of grisly, grotesque, and bloody. Some of them have objectionable cruelty, like the episode Nightmare, episode 11 that I mentioned, and that might be kind of traumatic to some people. Some of the others also have kind of disturbing content. Keeping in mind it's a horror series, you know you're going to see, blood and violence and things like that. It's not really a series for everyone. But overall the animation is okay, it's pretty good. There are some episodes better than others. I can give it a hesitant recommendation, and if you want to see what the fuss about Supernatural is, you'll get more of an idea of its best points from the animation than its worst. At least, as long as you skip the episodes I recommended you skip. This has been Hushicho Talks. Hope to see you next time. Thanks.